continue. All right, perfect. I see the room is getting full. Okay, perfect. All right, perfect. Should we give it another 2 minutes?
That sounds great.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to step out the camera for 2 seconds.
Hi, everyone who's joining us today, too. We're having folks stream in as we're speaking, and we should be starting shortly. I feel like we should have music, though. I haven't mastered how to plug in music into the Zoom.
Yeah, neither have I.
All right, I like the idea of a master music, so that's a good idea for the next Zahara's Dream session. Bojan, you're in charge of a DJ playlist.
Listen, I don't think you want to hear my beats. They're really an odd mix of Serbian music mixed with Arabic music mixed with American pop.
That's great, and then Harshani will bring some more.
It'll be chaos.
Yes. Maybe we can start the opening, and then I'll let you both take the floor for this second Be Powerfully Use streaming session. Yes? Okay, great. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our beautiful sisters and our brothers who are joining today. This is the second Be You Powerfully Zahara's Dream online session. And today we have the chance and beauty to be joined by Bojan and Harshani, who are both think tank and research experts. They work here in New York at NYU Center for I never get the acronym properly. Bojan is going to start me right now.
Center on International Education.
Great.
That always gets me too. I always want to say for, but it's actually on.
Thank you so much, Bojan. So today our two speakers are going to share with us how to build a career in think tank and in research. Those are incredible tools to have when we start a career and we're not sure how to go about, particularly when it comes to policy making, who are the various stakeholders, what are the available resources, and how do we get going. So Bojan and Harshani, thank you so much for joining us today. And I leave the floor for you to guide us through the process. Thank you so much to all the participants also who joined.
Thank you, Verlin. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I must say, I met Verlin about a year ago or so here. And one of the things that I greatly admire about her and the work that she's doing, she's not a think tank herself, but I've never seen somebody who can do convening as well as Verlin can. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I know you've been doing really tremendous work when it comes to African Women Leaders Network, and just the amount of national chapters that have been opening up in the past couple of months is really incredible. I'm letting some folks into the room as we're starting off. So welcome everyone who has joined us. We will have the chat feature going on, and I really welcome you to contribute there throughout the webinar. We're going to be pausing to look at some of the questions that are coming in. And it's always good to see who's joining us from different parts of the world. I want to encourage you to turn on your cameras, but obviously that is your option and a choice, but it's always good to see faces, even though we cannot be in person. It's good to be here virtually with you. The way we imagine this, maybe we can start with quick introductions about ourselves. And from there, we're keen to go into the conversation about three aspects, really. Harshani and I were keen to talk about things that our resumes might not necessarily say, and things that have led us to pursue the career that we did. From there, we'll go on to talking a little bit about this policy think tank influencing space, and what does it entail, who are some of the actors in that space, how we have ended up in that space. And then we're gonna wrap up with talking about Pathfinders, the initiative that we are working on right now. What do we do? And what are some of the big goals that we are trying and hoping to accomplish? And then we want to leave plenty of questions plenty of time for questions that you might have and for some of your reflections. And we're hoping to wrap it all up with an interactive exercise. So that's about us. Harshani, I'll turn it over maybe to you if you can give 101 about you and your career, and then I'll come back to me to do the same.
Thanks, Bojan, and it's really lovely to meet all of you. I hope you're all well and safe in your respective homes. I know times are troubling, but it's interesting that we still find these bright moments to come together. So it's really, really lovely to meet you. So as Bojan mentioned, my name is Harshani, and Bojan and I actually work together. I don't know if everyone knows that, but yes, we do. And, you know, I think just a quick spiel about me. I'm a human rights lawyer. I come from Australia, so that may be part of my accent, but I have a bit of a mixed background. My mum is Brazilian Portuguese and my dad is Sri Lankan, and I grew up in the Middle East and Australia, so my career is a real testament to my parents really and my journey throughout. So I'm really, really excited to be here and to share with Bojan some of my own career reflections and personal journeys with you all. But I am now a deputy director at the Pathfinders and sort of helped put together the strategy. And we initially started with a team of 4 and it's now grown to around 16 in the last 2 years. So it's been an exciting journey, which I'm very looking forward to sharing with you all.
And I guess I can take it out from here to say I'm part of that growth a little bit as well. I joined my name is Bojan, and I joined Pathfinders about a year ago. I worked there as a program associate on our violence work stream. Before that, I spent about 2.5, 3 years working for different missions around the UN on different security and disarmament issues. And I got my career start as a grassroots campaign organizer on the issue of immigration reform here in the US, back at a time when administration in the US was different and the dream of immigration reform was still possible. Sadly, that doesn't seem to be the case right now. Or one can say I didn't really do a good job back then to influence policy to get anything passed. One of the things that Harshani and I were keen to get a start on and to get the discussion going, you know, once we introduce ourselves, one talks about their career journeys and the things that they've done, but there are many things that are not necessarily spelled out on our resumes. And I know for Harshani, you mentioned you're Australian and you work in different parts of the world. You work for international development agencies. You work for international organizations. You work as a consultant. But I was curious, maybe if you can start by sharing what has been the pivotal moment that has really led you to pursue careers in international affairs and to pursue career in think tanks?
So it's a really interesting question because, you know, when I first started in human rights, I think I was always drawn to this field because by nature I was a minority, and by nature of being a woman of color, you know, it was difficult. But, you know, when I first started on this journey, you know, everyone assumed that it was a linear straight path, that it would be really easy to get to the UN. All you have to do is apply. And, you know, I think, you know, what Boyd and I have shared in preparing for this meeting was just how much of a zigzag it really is. That it really isn't just, you know, A to B to C. And sometimes you just go around in circles a little. You know, but I think one of the most pivotal moments in my career, you know, I started law in Australia studying because I thought I wanted to understand institutions. I really want to understand how society came to be and whether it was possible to change how societies function to be more equal, to be more fair, because I saw so much discrimination growing up. And I thought, being a lawyer, I would have the tools and the knowledge to change that, right? And I was visiting my grandparents in Sri Lanka around, I think it was like 2004, and I had just started my law degree. And, you know, we woke up one morning and, you know, we were too lazy to get out of bed. And my dad was like, it's fine, we don't have to go see your grandparents. I was like, yes. But, you know, the day of that day was the tsunami that hit South Asia, if you remember, during that time, Indonesia, it was a while ago, 2004, I think, and Sri Lanka, and that whole area just got decimated where my grandparents lived, and thankfully they were fine, but it caused such an unfathomable devastation, and we just got out of there immediately. But then I went back almost a month later, and I took 3-4 months off my law degree and just did some humanitarian work. And I went to the villages that were devastated, and I worked with communities and mothers who'd lost children, digging wells, not knowing how to dig one. And what it dawned on me was it wasn't enough to have institutions that work. It wasn't enough to have laws and books if people don't read them. And it impressed upon me the nature of poverty and the nature of these global crises that we're currently in that affect anyone, regardless of religion, culture, ethnicity. But at that time, the government's poor response meant that thousands died, not just in the immediate wake. And it really pushed me to learn more about development, to really understand like structural inequalities, why these things happen, have much more to do about human behavior and politics and our world order in a way that goes beyond what you learn in a textbook. And I think, after I finished that volunteer work, I went back to law school and I took completely different subjects. I went from, bankruptcy law to, women's rights to, to indigenous rights, everything about what I did in my law degree. I'm sorry. And almost every single career choice I made changed from that point onwards. So that was a real turning point for me. So Bojan, I'm going to turn it over to you for a question. I know, speaking on the theme of the zigzag, sometimes zigzags are positive and they're an upward trajectory. Sometimes zigzags go down, and through our careers, sometimes we meet sort of bottlenecks or challenges or things that are just really confusing or difficult. Can you share with the rest of us a moment that was really, really tough for you, and how that changed your career trajectory?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that Harshani and I are keen to talk about this aspect is to share that, there are so many points in your career, in your life, as you're making choices. The choices are not necessarily dictated only by passion, but they're also dictated by different circumstances that you find yourself in, different people that you might encounter on that journey, and different opportunities that might come along the way. For me, actually, one of the more difficult parts in the career journey and this trajectory was when I moved to New York. I spent a year after college initially working as a community organizer, as I mentioned, and I wrapped up my time there, and I was looking for the next opportunity. And then after seeing an internship opportunity at the Mission of Liechtenstein on a job ad, I called up a guy who I knew tangentially. I said, well, what is this opportunity about? I'm interested. And he said, well, here's the deal. Liechtenstein's a small country. They rely greatly on interns here to do a lot of the work. It's very interesting, engaging if you're interested in joining. And I was at the time in Chicago, finished my job, unsure where things are going further. I didn't know anyone in New York. I always had, this dream coming closer to the UN, contributing in some big grand fashion, this bigger goal of, world peace. And I said to myself, well, why not? Like, let's give it a shot. Let's give it an opportunity. So I showed up in New York. I was staying on a couch of a friend, since I didn't know anyone here. I had very little money in my savings account. I said, well, let's see where this is going to take me and where this is going to go. And now, typically when I tell the story, I spent 4 months there as an intern. I found, ways to survive and to make ends meet. And then one opportunity led to the other, and I kind of made a career there for 3 years. But I think that's story in itself oftentimes betrays the reality of those first couple of months as I moved to New York. The first time that I bought a suit, that I scrambled some money, the first time that I actually wore that suit, you know, and felt pressure that I need to perform. The first time, you know, that I felt under so much pressure in an environment where I typically didn't even imagine finding myself in, as I never imagined that all of a sudden I'll be wearing my suit to different important meetings. But throughout all this, I was very lucky to have mentors and to have friends and colleagues who were keen to give me opportunity, who showed me that there are ways and different ways that you can make your career in the service of these higher ideals and bigger and greater good. And I actually think this idea, you know, service in the cause, for a bigger cause, I think brings us up to a next question, Harshani, that I'm keen to ask you about is, you know, oftentimes I know for myself at the day, you know, doing good meant working for an established institution or, you know, going into the government and being a bureaucrat. But there's so much more other ways that one can influence policy in the world. And I was wondering if you can maybe share a little bit, what is this policy influencing space that we find ourselves in which think tanks operate?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, I often see in my work where policies go wrong is when they stop speaking to the people, when they stop addressing what people really want in their lives. And it's amazing how that small disconnect between policy making and people's needs and their concerns and dreams, that small disconnect can have like immediate and huge consequences for your communities, from election riots to, you know, discrimination, to lack of food and water, basic things. And I think in that space, you know, when you think about the fact that the UN is celebrating its 75th anniversary in September, 75 years from World War II, and the moment that we were as a world then to where we are now, it wasn't just the UN. I think that brought that movement together. It was a huge community of women's organizations, to civil society, to political leaders, to community leaders, a whole host of organizations. And our world has changed dramatically since then, both in terms of where we are in global politics, but also just where we are physically in our homes, you know, not able to go outside and using technology. And I think it breeds a lot of imagination and innovation to think about things that just were not possible, right? We're in another moment where, when the UN was first created to now, where we're thinking of things that were just not possible before. And I think this is where other sectors can breed imagination and innovation in a world that's just stuck. You know, from, you know, the last 2 to 3 years, what we see in our work is a growing sense of frustration and tension that, you know, the world and politics are not meeting people's needs. But we live in a moment now where COVID-19 has forced us to have a reality check. And I think this is where community organizing, development organizations, grassroots organizations that listen to the needs of people and advocate for them and ensure that leaders listen and implement policies that are aligned with how people feel is so much more critical in a moment like now. And how we organize and how we reach out, and even sessions like this is really, really important. I mean, you know, when I was young, feels like a while ago, but my story is similar to Bojan. You know, I thought the UN was the be all. You know, I went through an UN internship. I remember my first suit, my only suit, which, you know, I had to make it look like it was more than just the same suit. But, you know, I think one of the most, you know, pivotal parts of my career was when I wasn't at the UN, when I had to get creative and I had more impact, honestly. And I think that's where work like the Pathfinders, for example, is occupying a space outside of the UN. It's trying to mobilize different types of organizations on the ground and how to combine that with politics at a high government level. It occupies a space that is outside of the UN. And I think, I wish somebody had told me in the beginning, you know, the UN isn't everything. Try to get some experience outside and try to get some real concrete experience at a ground level, and also occupy space outside of the UN, because honestly, it can be more influential. If you think about the UN, it is 75 years old. It's equivalent of probably your grandmother or your grandfather. The way that it moves, the way that it thinks, it's not wrong, but it can be slow. And when you're young, you know, all you want to do is see impact. All you want to do is feel like you're part of something, right? And the best way to do that, I feel, is the space around it. And if you can influence the space around the UN, either through civil society or a think tank or research or advocacy, even social media, you can learn so much more about the UN sometimes than being inside it.
I think that's important to mention. You know, we think of an institution, you know, in national government, in countries that are national governments, then you have regional organizations, and you have international institutions, and there's a set of civil servants who are doing their job. But around them, I think this is important to really press upon, because it's going to situate what we're doing and where think tanks and research institutes fall. There is this microcosm and ecosystem of many other actors where the ideas for policies actually oftentimes get their origin, and where pressure is applied for some of these ideas to be turned into policy, to be implemented, and to eventually have an impact. I know, Harshani, you talked about, you know, working for a think tank as adding color to the drab policy space. I was hoping maybe you can expand a little bit more.
Well, I think that color is people's voices. And I think what's often missing, you know, even if you look at COVID-19 with policymaking and the immediate financing and government response, the immediateness of it shows how often that doesn't relate to what people actually need. People's jobs, you know, childcare issues, security issues, elections that have been delayed for several more years. And I think the color in the policy making is the ability to have different types of voices heard and reflected in that policy making. It's also the vibrancy of the civil society space, the organization, the sense of sort of networking, even networks like this. I mean, it is where we come together. And the policy making is meant to be representative of governments, sort of their, you know, them hearing the people, right? And I think we can't always think that that's going to be natural, that that's going to necessarily equate, policy making will necessarily equate in, you know, listening to people, which is why I think the color is exactly this, you know, the organization, the networking, the lobbying, the community activism. This is so crucial. And I think this is what it adds color to this space.
So, and this is what actually drew me to Pathfinders, and maybe this is a good segue for us to talk about some of the things that we are doing at the Center on International Cooperation. So Center on International Cooperation is a small think tank of about 30 people based at New York's university. And we are one of the few actors in this UN New York bubble space of policy influencing. We do research and policy advising on security, development, human rights more broadly. And Harshani and I find ourselves working for Pathfinders, for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Society, which is this unique initiative that's housed at the think tank itself. But it's really a hybrid that brings together governments. We have 36 Pathfinder governments. It brings together a whole slew of other stakeholders, different nonprofits and other organizations, all who are committed to making sure that the goal 16, the goal that relates to Sustainable Development Goal 16, the goal that relates to peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, that very big and ambitious goal, is actually brought into the reality. So we find ourselves working on different campaigns and initiatives, figuring out how we can accelerate the delivery and implementation of that goal. So there's a research component to it, looking for the best solutions out there on what can reduce crime and violence, be it in urban areas, be it in conflict affected areas. How can we figure out what are some of the best policies when it comes to reducing violence against women and children, for example, which is currently on our minds as we've seen the statistics increase significantly. But also figuring out how can we ensure and make sure that there is equal access to justice for all. We know from one of our landmark reports, for example, and Harshani, correct me if I'm wrong here, that 5.2 billion people across the world don't have access to justice. So what are different ways and initiatives that we can put forward and say, well, governments should consider implementing this, or an international organizations should consider putting their weight behind these solutions and policy ideas. So this is kind of where we find ourselves at, and we are in this hybrid model of mobilization, of research, of advocacy. And Harshani, I was hoping you can maybe speak more to what drew you to Pathfinders and what do you see our value at?
So I was going to ask you that question, so you stole it from me. So I will answer it and then you can answer it after me. You know, I think what's unique about Pathfinders is that it occupies a space in between. You know, the SDGs, or the UN 2030 Agenda, which I hope some of you know, but it was a moment in time 5 years ago now where all the governments of the UN came together. It's unbelievable now to think that all the governments of the UN would agree to anything now. But what they did agree to at that time were a bunch of goals that had all these dreams and aspirations around women's rights, to eradicating poverty, to you know, urban development, to, you know, an inclusive and peaceful world. It's hard to imagine that that happened 5 years ago. But, you know, I think what makes Pathfinders so unique is it took the seeds of that imagination. It took the seeds of that spirit and courage from member states and made them bloom. You know, it represents a core group of countries who said it wasn't enough that we agreed to something on paper, that we needed to actually, you know, make true on our promises, show something really is happening at a country level. Let's not just promise it at a UN and, you know, promise it behind back doors, but let's make true on what we have said. And so part of the Pathfinders is working with, you know, 35 countries who have said, we want to do more. And it's exciting because there is such, in a time where political will is declining, in a time where our global world is not as together as it used to be, that it's much more fractured, Pathfinders occupies a space where there is a little bit of light and tries to just expand that. And we work with partners on the ground, we work with our governments to identify, you know, what are their national aspirations, what are their priorities, what's not working on the ground, how can we make it work? What are some of the solutions that, you know, we're hearing from our partners that could work for you? So it's built on the premise of, you know, possibility, that we can get this job done, of what was agreed to in the 2030 agenda. And I think that spirit, not even just the mechanics of how we work, but that spirit, I think, is very, very rare in this sort of international relations politics space. But Bojan, I interviewed you a year and a half ago when you first joined Pathfinders, and I remember asking you, you know, why us? Why did you join? And now you've been here for a while with us. I can ask you again. Why do you think sort of Pathfinders is, you know, stands out, and, you know, other sort of organizations like us?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure many on this call knows, if we think about research institutes and we think about think tanks, they come in different shapes and sizes. So I talked about, you know, my interest just in general to find myself in this policy influencing circle, and I realized, well, one can do that, you know, in think tanks and academic institutions. They're different, as I said. There are those that, you know, in which you dedicate a significant amount of time poring over data, poring over literature reviews, doing in-depth studies, doing evaluations, and they do extremely important work. But what drew me to Pathfinders is, and what drew me to CIC is the fact that it's different. That it is, I think the jargon in the business is policy action oriented thinking, right? That it wasn't necessarily just about figuring out what ideas, solutions, policies work and measuring them and evaluating them, but it was also being bold about mobilizations, recognizing that to get anything done, one, it's not just enough to have an idea and put it out into the world. One needs to make that idea exciting. One needs to build a big coalition of actors, governments, non-governmental actors, international organizations, civil society, you go on. One needs to be mobilizing this community constantly and pushing for this idea forward, because otherwise it would be just that, an idea that's out there, that's a policy brief or a paper that very few people might have access to and very few people might engage in. And I think that's in our work, not to toot our own horn, but that's been one of the things that's been different for other organizations that are out there, which I think are developing, new models on how to do it, but are not there quite yet. I know one of the things that I'm observing in the chat function is we have quite a few questions are coming, which is great. I was wondering, I'm happy to get into the questions because really we're keen to include as many voices as we can. We got the discussion going, but we're also very keen to hear from you. And I think one of the first questions that I saw was from Ornella from Togo, who was asking about youth-led think tanks in the world and whether we've seen any impactful think tanks. Harshani, do you have any ideas there?
Yeah, so Ornella, that's an excellent question. And I just chatted in response. I think restless development is a really good example. It is predominantly youth-led, and I think it has like 20 or 25 offices around the world. And I've worked with them in Uganda and Kenya, and they do excellent work. And what they do is that they have a combination of both. They implement programs, youth-led programs in communities, but they also work in governments to inform policy making. They also have, a much more global advocacy. So sometimes we encounter them in the SDG 16 space in our work, but they're a good example of a think tank that has different models. I think what is important for a youth think tank is that it be led by youth, but it be a mix as well. But they're a good balance and a good example.
Yeah, I think it's a great question because for me, it's actually kind of hard to come up with examples of youth-led think tanks. We often think of people who are dealing with ideas and who are dealing with research are those, who have spent their time studying at universities and, who have gray hair and who have all the wisdom to dispense. But I actually think that's not the case. That's not where the idea should be coming from, right? The idea should be coming from a new generation that's faced with very different kind of world and very different kind of challenges that have existed, even 2 months ago at this point. So one I think should be making a stronger case for more youth-led think tanks, and actually just in general for more youth engagement in research and policy making. I'm seeing other questions come in. Let me just browse through the questions that are coming in chat, but also feel free to raise your hand here virtually, signal if you want to speak, because we want to hear your voices as well.
There was another question, Bojan, that related to Ornella's. I think it was Thandi. How do we ensure young people's role in policymaking through changing perceptions of their inexperience and reinforcing views about young people as change makers and agents for development and change? I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah.
And I think, it's really tough to change people's perceptions
Yes.
because the way that you look informs how, unfortunately, how people receive you. And I think that's particularly tough for women of color in any part of the world, just period. And I heard an excellent talk yesterday as part of the UN 75th celebrations, the birthday celebrations. And it was led by an old man who was around 75, talking about youth, which I found extremely ironic. And I tried to sort of curb my own cynicism. But as he gave the speech, he said he's been working with youth for the most of his life. And he actually sounded like a young person despite being 75. But what he said was, people will always deny you. People will always say, your voice is not strong enough, or your voice doesn't count. But you have to find a way to make it count. And sometimes that's increasing the volume. Sometimes that's trying to find different spaces, because you'll always, I still find that it's hard for my voice to be heard. And it isn't always converting the people who already agree with you, your friends, your family, your colleagues, even the youth space. I think what's really critical for youth engagement and for the people that don't agree with you is to influence them, right? Is to find a point where you do agree. And it has nothing to do about the way that you look. It has nothing to do about who you are. But if you can find 2 or 3 points of agreement and lobby for them, that's important. And I agree with Bojan's comment that, youth-led think tanks and organizations are critical, but it's even more important for youth to be embedded in existing systems and processes and organizations, and that they be given an equal voice and seat at the table, and that it's not, the youth person who only speaks for 2 minutes and then walks away, but they get a meaningful position that's equal and fair to everyone else. And I think that takes time, but it requires people like yourself to really push for it and make it happen.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this thread of meaningful engagement, right? Because oftentimes what we're seeing now is there is, in this policy spaces, there is a desire to include youth, right? But as I'm sure many of you know here, there's also tokenization that takes place, just installing youth for the sake of having youth at the table, hearing them out for a minute or two, and carrying on with the program. I would say, even if you think about, research institutes, if you think about think tanks, oftentimes when young people come and join, they are joining in the phase of, research assistants, etc. So where they are not out there necessarily, leading these research projects where they're putting the solutions and idea forward. So I guess one of the things I want to highlight is, even when once somebody gets into the spaces, there's still a battle and a long road ahead where one needs to claim the space. And as Harshani, you were mentioning, have this idea that no, like I'm here and my ideas value and matter, and I'm going to be working through these different systems and processes to make sure that they are heard. There is a question from Jackie. She was asking is how we can get involved in think tanks like Pathfinders, because in some countries, the opportunities for emerging young ladies are slim. And this ties really to many conversations Harshani and I were having about the idea of inclusion in these policy spaces, inclusion in research spaces, who's doing the research about who's putting the solutions and ideas forward. And the reality is that still most of the business is done far away from places where research might have an impact. And most of the business is done not by people who are looking as the people in the community about who the research is done. And this is where I think we need just a dramatic paradigm shift, even in the business of how we do business. I'm not quite sure that I figured out what the ideas are there, but I think one starts from working in partnership and engaging with people on the ground, wherever they are, right? That's one of the things I think for us as Pathfinders that we were keen to do is we recognize that we're a small team of 15 people on just the Pathfinders team. And everything that we do in partnership with other organizations, wherever they're located. Everything that we do in partnership with researchers, also wherever they're located in the world, because that magnifies our impact.
And it could also be part of the zigzag, right? If your end destination is that you want to work for something like Pathfinders, you'll find that you'll take many little steps to get there, which may not be, the straight, direct path. And by the time you do a few zigzags, you may realize that's not what you even wanted to do. When I first started, I wanted to be a human rights litigator and be in the court system. And after doing bits of that, I was like, hell no, I don't want to do this. But I think as a young person, you have the benefit of doing things differently without any rules, right? So, blog writing, social media, anything to get your voice heard, using technology, occupying a space that people think it doesn't exist yet, or, it isn't heard, but you could use different ways or different mechanisms to get there. And when I first started my career, I had my own sort of blog page. It sounds ridiculous, but I did. And I used to write on it consistently, my thoughts. And it was weird because in interviews it would come up and I'm like, God, people read this? It's tragic. But it actually showed that, people thought I had interesting ideas and I thought nobody would actually read this. And I didn't do it for my career. I actually just did it because I wanted to write. But blogs, videos, even Instagram accounts, how you connect with your communities, like get creative, and then use that to integrate into more formal like workspaces. Use the tools that you have to get into spaces that you feel are difficult to get into in the first place.
Right. We do have a question from Gladys, who's asking us how think tanks help build mechanism for government accountability. Yes, I would say depending on the type of think tank that it is, and depending on the type of research institutions, there it is. But there are specifically think tanks that are running research projects and they're looking into how government does its business. And I think they play an essential role in shedding light on some of the ways the government is doing or not doing its business, right? You have think tanks that are publishing reports that are looking into instances of government corruption. You have think tanks that are poring over data on budget expenditures and seeing where the money is allocated and whom the money is allocated to on a national level, but also there are think tanks who are doing that right on the international level when it comes to, for example, international aid. And they can spot some of the trends and say, well, there seems to be a concerning trend here where all the government contracts are going to the son of a president. Isn't that interesting, right? And here's the latest research case study to prove that. So yeah, I mean, we're very biased here. We work for, I think, not necessarily the one that's always shedding light on the government accountability. We are more so in the business of ideas and action. But we have, for example, as part of the Center for International Cooperation, where we're based, is Congo Research Group. And they do research specifically on the Democratic Republic of Congo and the political situation there. And they have had a trove of just invaluable resources, shedding light actually on the corruption in the country, which have been quite interesting and have garnered quite a bit of attention. Umi is asking us about sustainability of organizations, because many youth-led organizations start strong, and after a year or two, there are no more. I feel like, in my personal career, I was part of different organizations that I've started myself, initiatives that started out very strong, and then after a year or two, or sometimes even after a month or two, they were no more. What I found helpful in my career, and I'm going to give the floor to you, Harshani, to chime in as well, is working on projects in teams, because having a team of 3-5 people, a core group, has allowed projects to last longer, because if you get distracted by life or you lose interest, motivation, passion, there's somebody else who can step in and take the project forward. Working group comes with its own challenges, so I found it essential for that group to be really a core group of people who very much believe in the project, who very much believe in ideas, and who are keen and eager to take over the baton in the relay race if you get tired or if life gets in the way?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. You know, what people don't tell you when you start something is that it's almost like a business. And often people don't think of this space, NGOs or think tanks, as being like a business. Be economical, be smart, have a business plan. Think about first year, the second year, and the third year. And in the beginning, you're a businesswoman. You're fundraising, you're applying for grants, you're networking, you're making connections. It's not just the actual work that you're doing. And it may, in situations that I've been in, I've had to learn things that I didn't know I needed to know, from finances to Excel sheets, to grant making, to lobbying, to fundraising. I was an old woman shop at one point. And, I think it's a balance that you have to play both in building those skills and then your dreams. How much can you actually do in the first year or two? And if, how much steam and energy and finances will you have to continue that? And, it's sometimes just focusing on the building stage and the networking and the fundraising, and then, expanding from that. The initiatives that I've seen do really well, like even Pathfinders, it's not a great example, but it had no funding in the beginning, had lots of great ideas. And, we sort of hit a juncture where we just needed to fundraise and we weren't going to make it. Literally, we're not going to make it, which Bojan may not know this, but we went on a huge fundraising stream to make it work. And I think what we did in how we pitched to donors and pitched to our partners was how we were unique, what was our value add. But, I think having a strong business model, planning things out, and think of this like a business, not just an NGO, because people forget, the dreams and let go of the actual reality. I think that's a critical thing. And it may mean that you have to build new skills. I know too much about Excel than I ever really want to know for the rest of my life, but I am in good stead because of it.
Great. I'm mindful that we have about 10 minutes or so, and I was wondering maybe if we have any other questions. I would love to hear your voices, so feel free to chime in before we go on to our interactive part, interactive exercise, which hopefully is going to be interesting.
Yes. Anyone would like to add another question before we move on? And thank you so much, Bojan and Harshani. This was extremely informative, and I have a lot of notes for the wrap-up. So perhaps if there's any other questions, Bojan, would you like to proceed if there's no other question?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that Harshani and I were inspired by Zahara's dream and the work that you're doing, and I heard a little bit about the first webinar that you have where you're talking about building your career consciously. We were thinking of, all the dreams that we have and what are some of the things that we want to accomplish and do in life. So we created this poll where we were hoping that you can help us chime in. I'm going to share a link with you. I know it's Zoom, so you might have to copy and paste into your web browser. But we were hoping to get a graphical representation of what is the biggest dream for your career. As you type in some of the responses, they're going to be anonymous, but we're going to have a word cloud and see what are some of the common patterns and trends among this group. So we're running a mini research project.
If I may just share one point before, I want to share that the speaker of the first webinar, our sister Bosse, is actually online. She's here. Maybe she, afterwards, once we all share a dream, she could, come in and share her own biggest dream, which she shared in the first webinar, but perhaps she can develop a bit more here at the end also before we turn off. Thank you so much for the poll. We're going to take it. Thank you.
Maybe we'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute, to fill out this poll, and we're going to be able to pull up the results and see what are some of the things that have emerged. maybe in the meantime, as the poll is being taken, I know we're coming close to the end. Harshani and I wanted to leave the group with some of the ideas of, besides Center International International Cooperation, besides Pathfinders, on what are some of the other organizations in this space, think tanks, research institutes that we admire, whose work that we look up to. So you can look them up and see if this is something that relates to your work that you find interesting. I have my three. Do you want me to start, Harshani, or would you like to share yours?
Why don't you start?
Sure. I would say at the top of my list, and I'll type all these in as I'm speaking, would be International Crisis Group, a think tank that's based here in New York, but that just provides some very solid analysis on the global violence trends across the world. There is also, this is not necessarily a think tank, but an organization, the centralized organizations that I think do very important work, but United Nations associations across the world in different countries, in different cities, I think do valuable work and contribute so much in general to the discourse around the UN. And the third think tank that I'm going to share, and this is a little bit niche and really relates to some of the work that I'm doing now. It is Small Arms Survey. They're a think tank that do research on firearms and are highly focused, data-driven, and very much in this space of violent deaths and firearms. So yeah, a mix of three.
So the one for mine, let me just share, and it isn't actually relevant to the policy space, but I found it relevant for my career. It was a book that was written by a very famous feminist called Ursula Le Guin. She was also an author, and she wrote this in 1974, and it's called The Dispossessed, and it starts off. It's a story, a sci-fi story, and it starts off about this young man who's just different from everybody else, and he thinks differently from everybody else, and his society is making him conform. And he tries his best, and his government basically denies him just basic liberties and freedoms. And it's his sort of process and journey to find out who he really is, and to carve a society where people who are different are able to sort of be heard. It gets a little bit strange because it's sci-fi, but when I was reading it, and it was interesting because it was written by a woman through the eyes of a man, and some of the challenges I felt, I could actually relate to. So I often wondered when I was reading this story whether she did that deliberately. And this book had, at that time, was a huge sort of feminist movement in the US and in other parts of the world. And when I was at school, this was one of the books that I was asked to read, because women would often take different perspectives to influence people who were not the same, right? So this was her take on doing that. So it was informative for me at the time when I was reading it.
Great. Well, I think we have some results coming in. I was wondering, Harshani, if you can pull up the results map.
Yeah, I'm trying to, and I'm having technology problems. Just give me a second. One sec.
One spends a lot of time on Zoom calls, and you would think that by this stage we would be experts in all the features of Zoom and different other upgrades, updates, and technologies that we're using, but that's not necessarily always the case. So we beg for your forgiveness on that front.
If I may, Bojan and Harshani, looking at how the world is going, we may have few additional weeks to learn all the Zoom.
Sure. Oh, Harshani, I think you're speaking and we cannot hear you too.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just saying that my partner, my boyfriend, he wiped my computer yesterday just to make it run faster because I was complaining that things were running too slow. And I think that included all my passwords. So I'm just trying to figure out how to log in. Just give me a second.
Well, I was wondering, maybe I'd be also curious to, if you can share with us, what are some of the upcoming topics that you're going to be covering in the future webinars, if you have
Absolutely.
some in
Yes.
plan?
Thank you very much, Bojan. When it comes to the future webinars, I think we're really focusing on building not only the career and professional aspect, but also the personal aspect. And one of the future speakers is actually here. Her name is Tondi. She's my sister, our sister from South Africa. Sorry to put you on the spotlight. But perhaps she can give a few words for, she's our good sister to all of us here, and she works at the Permanent Mission of South Africa to the UN, and she's an incredible human being who's focused on also recentering, internal happiness and making sure that we give back. So we're going to talk a lot in the next webinars also on personal development, and I thank you and Harshani for sharing your journey, to professional development, which is key as human being. But I think one of the key element also is to make sure that we're aligned, within ourselves, and how do we make sure that we have good mental health, for instance, in such a difficult environment. How do we make sure that we tap into our inner strength, to overcome many of the zigzag, Harshani, you've mentioned, when we navigate professional development. So our sister Tondi is going to also discuss personal development. I'm sure she is thinking about the details of the engagement, but Zahara Stream is really a convening platform, and you mentioned it at the beginning, Bojan. How do we make sure, because one person or one organization cannot have all the answers and all, all the path and solutions forward. So the idea, and I'm going into my concluding points. I took a lot of notes when you were talking. I don't want to spoil the conclusion, but I think the takeout, the main one is that if we want to go far, we have to go together, and that's something that I learned earlier on in my career starting. You can go fast and you can go alone. You get tired, as you mentioned, after 1 year, maybe organizations are going to fall down. But if you're together, we can aspire to bring dignity into people's lives, bringing the necessary tools to make sure that, we can grow both personally and professionally. So the hope is that the next webinars will touch a bit on those issues. And yes, that's it. So I'll keep the concluding points for after. Thank you.
Great, because that was excellent. I figured out how to do this. So I'm sharing everybody the link to all your responses. It's an image.
Maybe in case the link is not working, I can actually pop it out on everyone's screen.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Just give me a second here. One of the things with Zoom is that the links are not necessarily opening up. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with everyone. Voila. Share. So when it comes to the biggest dream for your careers, in the center, unsurprisingly for this group, is women, policy, international. Some of the words that are standing out for me is creating, achieving, dignity, right? This is a group of idealists that is brought together. So it's unsurprising to see that. Platforms, another word that I see stand out there. That's very important, as we'd like to think of ourselves as a platform, and Zahara is a platform that is bringing in people together. I was wondering, Harshani, any reflections on your end?
Yeah, no, I think this is beautiful. I think this is illustrative of, the marrying of all these different ideas across this group. And, human union, dignity, empowerment, mentorship, influence, mobilizing, equality. I mean, this is almost sort of a mantra uh, for all the sort of different aspirations. And what's
Yeah.
interesting, it's not a career itself. It's not a position at the UN. It's not a position in a think tank. But if you were to imagine all of these linking together, this is sort of something that you could do anywhere. It's just finding
Yes.
the right niche that speaks best to you. So I think this is amazing.
No, thank you for sharing that with us. We'll make sure that you get the copy of this link, and maybe this is something that can be distributed also after the webinar.
This is beautiful.
There are some words I don't know here, like, where is it? There was something here. I can't see it anymore. Sorry, I'm going to butcher this word. Chimamanda?
Chimamanda, the famous Nigerian author.
Oh, very cool. I will have to look that up.
I wanted to give the floor perhaps before we wrapped up to both the previous speakers, but it seems that she's gone. Unfortunately, it's beautiful when we're having fun. We don't see time going. But it seems that we're the talk, the Be You Powerfully talk is coming to a close end. But before we wrap up, perhaps if there are any comments from the participants, any questions that we could take, one last perhaps before we go.
Please, I would very much love that to hear your voices.
Don't be shy. Bojan and Harshani are really nice.
We promise.
Tondi.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you so much for this very informative discussion. It was less of a briefing and more of a discussion. I think we're so used to in our line of work sitting in these very long, briefings and the Q&As, they become a little bit monotonous at times. So I really enjoyed this because it really engaged the core, I think, of what represents all of us. I'm like the rest of us, I'm very passionate about, policy making and young people and women. And I really feel that it's time to give light and to give life to that. Less talk, more action. I think that is one of the most famous flaws of the UN, for example. And I think that's that's our role as young people, as women as well, to really implement some of these policies that come out of a global institution like the UN. And we should actually use that as an existing mechanism to build on and strengthen already existing ideas, because the ideas are not bad. I just think it's the management and the implementation of that which has its shortcomings. And 10 years, it's 10 years now until the realization of the SDGs. We have so much work to do. And now with the COVID, which is somewhat setting us, you could say 10 steps back, I think we have a lot more work to do. Post-COVID, I think we have to have a more action-oriented world where policies are also speaking to what can be done on the ground. Because I think a lot of the time, there's a very blanket approach without effectively considering the complex context. Right now, the big debate is, on the digital divide and how children and university students need to work from home. But how, if you're a student in a village somewhere, how's that going to work if you don't have the infrastructure? So I think we really need to give life to the real realities on the ground going forward. When we say, if we